In the quiet suburb of Baldwinboro, Pennsylvania, a community was shaken to its core on February 9th, 2024. At approximately 4:32 p.m., Allegheny County 911 received a distressing call reporting a shooting in the 5400 block of Youngridge Drive. First responders arrived to a harrowing scene. 20-year-old Ramaya Remy Griffin lay lifeless in her apartment, having suffered multiple gunshot wounds. In a nearby room, her 1-year-old daughter was found unharmed, a small beacon of hope amidst the tragedy. The investigation swiftly unfolded. Detectives from the Allegheny County Police Homicide Unit meticulously combed through evidence, conducted numerous interviews, and reviewed surveillance footage. Their efforts led them to 22-year-old Adeline Itongwa of Monroeville, the father of Ramaya's child. On February 13th, 2024, authorities arrested Itongwa, charging him with criminal homicide and endangering the welfare of a child. Family members grappled with the devastating loss. Ramaya's sister, Mariah, recounted the complex relationship between Ramaya and Itongwa. They had been together for 4 years but parted ways after their daughter's birth. Despite their separation, they maintained a co-parenting arrangement that appeared amicable on the surface. However, Mariah harbored concerns about Itongwa's character, describing him as a shady person. She recalled his unsettling presence at Ramaya's funeral, where he sat quietly, offering no words. The arrest of Itongwa brought a mix of relief and sorrow to the family. They learned of his apprehension en route to a custody hearing for Ramaya's daughter. Mariah expressed the family's sentiments. "We're happy they found who did it, but we're still grieving the loss of my sister." In the wake of this tragedy, the community rallied to honor Ramaya's memory. A vigil was held at the Stowe Rocks High School football field, where friends, family, and community members gathered to pay their respects to the young mother whose life was senselessly cut short. As the legal process unfolds, the community remains steadfast in its pursuit of justice for Ramaya Griffin, ensuring her memory endures, and her story serves as a poignant reminder of the profound impact of domestic violence. In the heart of Pennsylvania, nestled within the communities of Stowe Township and McKees Rocks, lies Stowe Rocks High School, a beacon of education and community spirit. Established in 1966, this institution has been instrumental in shaping the lives of many young individuals, including the late Ramaya Remy Griffin. Ramaya's journey through Stowe Rocks High School was marked by active participation in various school activities, reflecting her vibrant personality and commitment to personal growth. Stowe Rocks High School, located at 1105 Valley Street, McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania, serves as the sole high school of the Stowe Rocks School District. The school caters to students from grades 7 through 12, fostering an environment that encourages academic excellence and personal development. With a dedicated staff and a diverse student body, Stowe Rocks High School offers a range of programs designed to meet the varied interests and aspirations of its students. Throughout her time at Stowe Rocks, Ramaya was known for her enthusiasm and dedication. She engaged in numerous extracurricular activities, showcasing her multifaceted talents and interests. Her peers and teachers remember her as a student who was always eager to participate and contribute positively to the school community. The school's commitment to fostering well-rounded individuals is evident in its support for various student-led initiatives and organizations. Ramaya's involvement in these activities not only honed her leadership skills, but also deepened her connection to her community. Her legacy continues to inspire current students to engage actively and make meaningful contributions. In the wake of her tragic passing, the Stowe Rocks community came together to honor Ramaya's memory. A vigil held at the school's football field saw friends, family, and community members gather to pay their respects. This outpouring of support underscores the profound impact Ramaya had on those around her and the indelible mark she left on her alma mater. As the community continues to mourn, Stowe Rocks High School remains committed to upholding the values that Ramaya embodied: kindness, dedication, and a passion for growth. Her story serves as a poignant reminder of the importance of community and the lasting influence one individual can have on the lives of many. Every love story has its chapters, some filled with joy, some with hardship. For Ramaya Griffin and Adeline Itongwa, their story began with love, but it ended in unimaginable tragedy. Their relationship spanned 4 years, a time filled with promise, devotion, and the responsibilities of young parenthood. But something changed along the way, something that would later raise questions about what truly happened behind closed doors. Ramaya and Adeline were young, in love, and full of dreams. To many who saw them together, they seemed to have a solid relationship. But beneath the surface, cracks were slowly forming, cracks that no one fully understood at the time. Motherhood transformed Ramaya's life. She took her role seriously and devoted herself to her daughter's happiness. But as Ramaya focused on her child, something between her and Etongwa started to change. Co-parenting can be challenging, even in the most amicable situations. But for Ramaya, this new dynamic with Etongwa was not as simple as it seemed. From the outside, it looked like a peaceful co-parenting situation, but sometimes the hardest struggles are the ones hidden from view. In hindsight, family members would wonder, were there signs they missed? Were there warnings that could have changed the course of what was to come? Ramaya had no idea that within days her life would come to a tragic and violent end, and the man she once loved, the father of her child, would soon be the prime suspect in her murder. In the blink of an eye, a mother's life was stolen. A child was left without her mother, and the world would soon learn the devastating truth about what happened behind closed doors. February 9th, 2024. It was a cold winter night in Baldwin Borough, Pennsylvania. Most people in the quiet residential area were asleep, but inside one apartment, something unthinkable was about to happen. A young mother, alone with her child, had no idea that within moments her life would be taken in a brutal and senseless act of violence. There were no screams, no calls for help, no shattered glass or forced entry, just the quiet stillness of the night. But at around 3 a.m., that silence was shattered by the sound of gunfire. Whoever pulled the trigger made one thing clear: this was personal. For hours, Ramaya's body remained inside her apartment. Her daughter, too young to understand, stayed in the adjacent room. No one knew what had happened. No one had heard the shots. No one called for help. Until later that afternoon, when police arrived at Youngridge Drive. Ramaya Griffin was lying lifeless in her own home, her body riddled with bullets. Her daughter found nearby, frightened but physically unharmed. It was a horrific scene, a mother's life stolen, a child left alone, and no clear answers as to why. The Allegheny County Police Department's homicide unit was immediately called in. Detectives began analyzing the scene, piecing together the timeline of events. And then came the biggest question: who would do this? Detectives now had to answer the toughest question: who wanted Ramaya dead, and why? As detectives reviewed security footage and conducted interviews, one name kept coming up: Adeline Etongwa. But was he involved, or was this just a tragic coincidence? What detectives uncovered next would send shockwaves through the community. A young mother was gone, a child left behind, a brutal crime committed in the dead of night. But the biggest question remained: who pulled the trigger, and why? For the Allegheny County Police Department, this was not just another case. This was a murder that sent shockwaves through the community. A senseless act of violence that left a family shattered. Detectives knew they had to work quickly. Every second mattered. Every piece of evidence was crucial. The longer it took to find a suspect, the harder it would be to bring them to justice. And so, the investigation began. The first step was to examine the crime scene. Every crime tells a story, and it was up to forensic experts to read between the lines. They started inside Ramaya's apartment, searching for anything that might provide a clue about her final moments. 12 shots. That was the first chilling discovery. The walls were riddled with bullets. The placement of each shot told a story of rage, of intent. This wasn't a single gunshot in a moment of fear. This was execution. Whoever fired the weapon made sure there was no chance of survival. Ballistic analysis confirmed that all 12 bullets came from the same gun, but there was another disturbing detail. Ramaya had been shot at close range. This meant her killer had stood just feet away from her, aiming directly at her as they pulled the trigger over and over again. Yet there were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no kicked-in doors. Whoever had done this had walked right in. This meant one thing. Ramaya had let them inside. She knew her killer. Her 1-year-old daughter, just a baby, had been found in the next room, unharmed but alone. For over 13 hours, that child had been left in the apartment with her mother's lifeless body. The thought was unbearable. And so, investigators faced the most urgent question of all. Who would do this? Detectives knew that in cases like these, the first place to look was close to home. Most violent crimes of this nature aren't committed by strangers. They're committed by someone the victim trusted, someone with a motive, someone with a connection. They began their search by canvassing the area, speaking with neighbors, asking if anyone had heard or seen anything suspicious that night. Some residents mentioned hearing muffled sounds, what they thought could have been fireworks or distant arguing, but none of them immediately thought it was gunfire. Others recalled seeing a man dressed in dark clothing entering the building late at night, but in the darkness, they couldn't make out his face. The next step was security footage. The apartment complex itself had no cameras, but nearby buildings did. Detectives combed through hours of grainy footage, watching cars pass by, people come and go. And then, they found something. A figure, cloaked in darkness, moving toward Ramaya's apartment complex. The timestamp read 2:45 a.m., just minutes before the estimated time of the shooting. It wasn't enough to make an arrest. The footage was blurry, the figure barely distinguishable. But detectives kept looking, comparing the figure's movements to images of people in Ramaya's life. The way they walked, the way they carried themselves, it all seemed strangely familiar. And then, they saw it. The posture, the stride, it all pointed to one man, Adeline Itongwa. To those who knew Ramaya best, the name was no surprise. Adeline Itongwa wasn't just someone in her life. He was the father of her child, a man she had once loved, but someone she had chosen to walk away from. Their relationship had been over for months, but they still had ties. Ties that couldn't be cut, not when a child was involved. But could he have done this? Could he have been capable of something so horrific? Ramaya's family had their suspicions. Her sister Mariah later recalled the unease she had always felt around him. Something was just off, she would say. And then there was the funeral. Itongwa had shown up. He had sat in silence. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He hadn't shed a tear. He had left before the service was even over. At the time, people thought it was grief. Maybe he was just in shock. But after detectives began to piece together the evidence, that silence started to feel like something else. Guilt. Detectives also had another crucial piece of evidence. Ramaya's phone records. Her last known phone call was to none other than Itongwa. Just minutes before the estimated time of her death, they had spoken. What was said in that conversation? Was it an argument? A confrontation? Or had she simply invited him over, unaware of the danger she was in? With the security footage, the witness statements, and the phone records, detectives had enough to take action. They couldn't wait any longer. If Itongwa was responsible, they needed to bring him in. February 13th, 2024. Just days after Ramaya's murder, police made their move. A warrant was issued for Adeline Itongwa's arrest. Officers tracked him to Monroeville, Pennsylvania, where he was staying. He didn't resist. There was no dramatic chase, no fight. He went quietly, calmly, as if he had already accepted his fate. He was charged with criminal homicide and endangering the welfare of a child. The news spread quickly. Ramaya's family, her friends, the entire community, all were waiting for answers, for justice. For some, the arrest was a shock. For others, it was exactly what they had suspected all along. A man who had once been part of Ramaya's life was now accused of taking it away. As he was led away in handcuffs, cameras captured his expression. Blank, emotionless. A man accused of murder, but one who showed no outward signs of remorse. For Ramaya's family, the moment was bittersweet. They had wanted justice. They had wanted answers. But no matter what happened next, one truth remained. Ramaya was gone, and nothing could bring her back. Now the real battle would begin. A battle in the courtroom. A battle for the truth. A battle to make sure that the man accused of this crime would pay for what he had done. The road to justice had just begun. Grief is a heavy thing. It comes in waves, sometimes slow, creeping up on you when you least expect it. Other times it crashes down all at once, leaving you gasping for air. For Ramaya Griffin's family, the waves never stopped. They didn't have time to process, to breathe, to understand. One moment she was here, laughing, loving, living. The next she was gone. And no amount of words, no amount of tears could ever bring her back. When a loved one is taken so violently, so unexpectedly, the mind refuses to accept it. It replays every memory, searches for signs, tries to piece together something that will make it all make sense. But there was no sense in this. There was only pain. Ramaya wasn't just another name in the news. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a mother. And in the days following her death, the weight of her absence became unbearable for those who loved her. Shock, disbelief, anger, a hurricane of emotions hit the Griffin family when they learned the truth. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some random act of violence. It was someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone they had welcomed into their lives. It was Adeline Itongwa, the father of Ramaya's child, the man who, just days earlier, had been sitting among them, silent, unassuming, hiding in plain sight. The moment the police confirmed his arrest, the grief took on a new shape. It was no longer just sorrow. It was betrayal. It was rage. The idea that he had been there, watching them cry, standing at the funeral, pretending to mourn, it made their stomachs turn. He had held their daughter. He had spoken to them. And all the while, he knew exactly what he had done. Mariah, Ramaya's sister, recalled the exact moment she found out. She was on her way to a custody hearing for her niece when she got the call. She could barely register the words. Her hands were shaking, her heart racing. It was him. It was him all along. She felt sick. How could he? How could someone who once claimed to love her sister do something so monstrous? No one is ever truly ready to say goodbye. Funerals are supposed to bring closure, a final farewell. But how do you say goodbye when the loss is so senseless, so cruel? How do you stand in a church surrounded by the weight of grief and accept that someone you love is never coming back? Ramaya's funeral was held in the days after her passing. The church was filled to capacity. Family, friends, teachers, neighbors, even strangers who had been touched by her story. There were flowers, prayers, tears. Her mother sat in the front row, unable to look at the casket, unable to believe that inside was her baby girl. Mariah held her hand, squeezing it tight, trying to be strong for her, though she felt like she was breaking apart inside. And then there was him, Adeline Itongwa, sitting in the back, silent, watching, a man who had been invited to grieve with them, a man who should have been heartbroken. But he wasn't crying. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't doing anything at all. Mariah kept glancing at him, trying to read his face, looking for any sign of remorse, any flicker of emotion. But there was nothing, just an empty stare. And that moment, those minutes of eerie silence, would haunt her forever. He left before the service ended, slipped out quietly without a word. It wouldn't be long before they knew why. Grief doesn't just belong to the family, it spreads. It moves through a community like a shadow, touching everyone in its path. Ramaya was not just mourned by her loved ones, she was mourned by an entire town. Teachers from Stowe Rocks High School came, remembering the bright young woman who once walked their halls. Friends spoke about her laughter, her kindness, her dreams. Neighbors left candles and flowers outside her apartment, whispering prayers for her soul. The pain was shared, and so was the demand for justice. In the days that followed, the community gathered. They stood together in her honor. At Stowe Rocks High School's football field, a vigil was held. Hundreds of candles flickered in the night, their flames dancing in the wind, a silent promise that she would not be forgotten. People held hands, tears streaming down their faces, voices cracking as they spoke her name. Justice for Ramaya. It wasn't just a phrase, it was a mission. Social media erupted. Thus, justice for Ramaya. People who had never met her were sharing her story, demanding answers. demanding accountability. Because this was not just another crime. This was not something that could be ignored. This was a young woman's life, stolen in a moment of violence, and it would not be swept under the rug. But no amount of hashtags, no amount of candlelight could undo what had been done. The reality remained. Ramaya was gone. Her daughter would grow up without her mother. Her family would never hear her voice again, never see her smile, never hold her in their arms. The only thing left was justice, and that fight had just begun. Grief is never silent. It echoes through the hearts of those left behind, through the empty spaces where laughter once filled the air, through the unanswered questions that haunt the minds of those who love the one who is gone. And in the wake of Ramaya Griffin's tragic death, the echoes of grief became a rallying cry for justice. In the days following her murder, shock and sorrow rippled through the community. Friends, neighbors, teachers, and former classmates struggled to process the devastating loss. How could something like this happen? How could a young mother, full of promise, be taken so violently? It was a question no one could answer. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. Ramaya's life would not be forgotten. For those who knew Ramaya best, the pain was indescribable. Her family had lost a daughter, a sister, a mother. But outside of that inner circle, Ramaya had also been a part of something larger: her school, her community, the friends she had made over the years. And in the days after her death, those people refused to stand by in silence. It started with conversations, exchanges in grocery store aisles, whispers in school hallways, posts on social media. Stories about Ramaya poured out: the young girl with a bright smile, the mother who adored her daughter, the sister who was always there, the friend who had dreams she was just beginning to chase. The more people talked, the more one message became clear. Ramaya's story could not end in tragedy alone. Her name had to be remembered. Her life had to mean something beyond the senseless act of violence. And so, plans began. The community wanted to do something that would show Ramaya's family they weren't alone, something that would remind the world that her life mattered. A vigil was organized, a night to honor her, to celebrate who she was, and to demand justice for what had been done to her. On a cold evening, just days after Ramaya's death, the people of McKees Rocks gathered. The parking lot outside Stowe Rocks High School, a place Ramaya had once walked as a student, became a place of remembrance. Candles were passed from hand to hand, their small flames flickering against the night sky. As the sun set, the glow of the candlelight spread, illuminating the faces of those who had come to pay their respects. Family members stood at the front, huddled together, leaning on one another for strength. Friends held on to each other, tears slipping down their cheeks as they whispered stories of Ramaya's kindness, her laughter, her dreams. A hush fell over the crowd as the first speaker stepped forward. A close friend of Ramaya's, her voice shaking with emotion, shared memories of late-night talks and childhood adventures. "She wasn't just my friend," she said. "She was family, and family doesn't forget." Next, a former teacher spoke, remembering the bright, determined student Ramaya had been. "She had dreams," the teacher said. "She wanted to build a future for herself and her daughter. She worked hard. She had so much ahead of her." And then her sister Mariah took the microphone. Her voice was strong, but beneath it there was pain, an unbearable weight of loss that no words could truly convey. "I shouldn't have to stand here and say goodbye to my sister," she said. "I shouldn't have to tell my niece that her mother isn't coming back. But here we are, and if we have to be here, then let me say this. Ramaya's name will not be forgotten. Justice will be served, and we will not stop until it is." The crowd erupted in applause. Some people wept. Others raised their candles higher. The air was thick with emotion, grief, love, anger, determination. In that moment, Ramaya's story became more than just tragedy. It became a movement. As the vigil continued, more voices joined the call for justice. Activists spoke out, demanding accountability. Local leaders vowed to support the family, to push for answers. People who had never even met Ramaya found themselves deeply moved by her story, by the injustice of her loss. They pledged to stand with her family, to make sure her death was not just another statistic, Another case forgotten with time. Throughout the night, messages of support poured in. Social media flooded with posts bearing the hashtag number sign, Justice for Ramaya. People who had never spoken to each other before that night found themselves united in a shared purpose, to make sure Ramaya's story was heard. But for Ramaya's family, no amount of support could change one painful reality. She was gone. No rally, no candlelight, no outpouring of love could bring her back. And yet, in the midst of their grief, they found strength in the people around them. They saw how deeply Ramaya had touched lives, and they knew they would not have to walk this road alone. As the last candles burned low, as people hugged each other goodbye and wiped away their tears, one thing was clear: the fight was far from over. An arrest had been made, but justice had not yet been served. There was still a trial ahead, a battle in the courtroom that would determine whether the man accused of taking Ramaya's life would pay for what he had done. For Ramaya's family, the vigil was just the beginning of a fight that would take months, possibly years, the beginning of a journey they never asked for, but one they were now forced to walk. But they would not walk it alone. Their community had spoken. They would stand beside them. They would lift Ramaya's name high. And no matter how long it took, they would not stop until justice was served. Because Ramaya Griffin was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother, a friend, and she would never be forgotten. With the arrest of Adeline Tongwa, one chapter of this tragedy had closed, but another had just begun. The legal system would now take over, and the long fight for justice was only beginning. Adeline Tongwa now sat behind bars, charged with criminal homicide and endangering the welfare of a child. He was being held at the Allegheny County Jail, awaiting trial, a process that could take months, even years. The weight of the charges against him was undeniable. If convicted, he could face a life sentence. But in the eyes of Ramaya's grieving family, no punishment could ever undo the horror of what had been done. No verdict, no sentence could bring her back. The road to justice is rarely swift, and for Ramaya's family, the process ahead would be grueling. Prosecutors would need to present an airtight case. Every detail of that tragic night would be laid bare in a courtroom. The gunshots, the lack of forced entry, the security footage, the phone records. Investigators had gathered their evidence. The case against Itongwa was strong, but the burden of proof lay with the prosecution. They would have to convince a jury beyond any reasonable doubt that Itongwa was responsible for Ramaya's murder. Meanwhile, the defense would mount its own case. Would they claim innocence? Would they attempt to discredit the evidence? Would they argue that someone else was responsible? These were the questions Ramaya's family feared the most. Because even when the truth seems clear, the justice system is never simple. There were legal precedents of similar cases where convictions had been overturned, where key evidence had been thrown out, where killers had walked free. And Ramaya's family knew they could not afford to lose this fight. Every hearing, every legal motion, every delay would feel like another wound. Each time they stepped into that courtroom, they would relive their pain. They would hear her name spoken over and over again, not in stories of her laughter, not in memories of the life she lived, but in legal arguments about the night she died. And all they could do was wait. Wait for justice. Wait for a verdict. Wait for the moment they could finally say that Ramaya's killer had been held accountable. Beyond the courtroom, Ramaya's death forced a larger conversation, one that was both urgent and heartbreaking. Because Ramaya was not alone. Every year, countless women lose their lives at the hands of intimate partners or former partners. Domestic violence does not always leave bruises. Sometimes it is quiet, hidden in threats, in control, in the slow erosion of a person's safety until, one day, it turns fatal. Statistics show that the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is when they try to leave. And Ramaya had left. She had moved forward, choosing to co-parent rather than remain in a toxic relationship. But sometimes even that isn't enough. Sometimes the danger does not end when the relationship does. For women in co-parenting situations with volatile partners, the risk remains, a reality that Ramaya's family now knew too well. Her death raised painful but necessary questions. How do we protect women like Ramaya? How do we recognize the warning signs before it's too late? How do we ensure that those who pose a danger do not get the chance to destroy another life? These are questions without easy answers, but they must be asked, and they must be answered. Because Ramaya's story cannot be just another statistic. It must be a wake-up call, a reminder that danger does not always come from a stranger in the dark, but from the people we once trusted, from the hands that once held our own. And if her story can save even one life, if one woman hears this and recognizes the signs, if one person reaches out for help, then maybe, just maybe, her loss will not have been in vain. For Ramaya's family, there is no true justice. Not in a courtroom, not in a prison sentence. Justice would be Ramaya watching her daughter grow up. Justice would be Ramaya living out her dreams, finishing her degree, building the life she wanted. Justice would be a world in which she was still here. But in the absence of true justice, there is remembrance, and those who loved her will make sure that her name is never forgotten. They will tell her story. They will speak her name. They will ensure that the world remembers Ramaya Griffin, not for how she died, but for how she lived. A daughter, a sister, a mother, a friend, a young woman who deserves so much more than what she was given. Rest in peace, Ramaya Griffin. You are loved, you are missed, and you will never be forgotten. Ramaya Griffin's story is a painful reminder of the dangers so many people face behind closed doors. But stories like hers need to be told. Her life mattered, and her legacy deserves to live on. That's why it's important to continue sharing these stories, raising awareness, and keeping the conversation going. If this story impacted you, if you believe in justice for victims like Ramaya, and if you want to see more real-life cases brought to light, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that matter, exposing the truth, and making sure the voices of those we've lost are never silenced. Hit the like button, share this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Let's keep the fight for justice alive, together.